everyone, and welcome back to Path of Exile 2. Today, we're diving into one of the craziest map-clearing, boss-melting builds, Tempest Flurry Madness. This build lets you shred maps, delete bosses, and feel unstoppable, all with minimal effort. And while some parts of the build can get expensive, I've included gear replacements so you can start strong and upgrade as you go. With capped resistances, a massive energy shield pool, a big health pool, and auto-triggered attacks, this build delivers insane survivability and damage at every stage of the game. If you want a fun, powerful, and effortless build that dominates everything from leveling to tier 4 bosses, this is it. Now, let's break it down. Let's start with the most important part of the build, which is the skills. I'll go through them in order of priority, so if you're short on sockets, you'll know exactly what to focus on first. Our main damage dealer and the heart of the build is Tempest Flurry. This skill does everything. It's our main attack, movement ability, and the trigger for insane damage. To make it even more powerful, we support it with Inspiration, which reduces 40% of the skill cost, allowing us to attack continuously without running out of mana. Then we add Rage, which generates stacks over time, increasing our attack damage significantly. Martial Tempo gives us 25% more attack speed, ensuring we're constantly hitting, while Primal Armament boosts our elemental damage by 25%, pushing our DPS even higher. Finally, Inevitable Critical builds up critical strike chance over time, making sure almost every hit is a crit. With this setup, Tempest Flurry alone can wipe out everything in sight, but we're just getting started. Next, we have Cast on Critical, which is one of the most powerful parts of the build. While it isn't expensive, as it costs 100 spirit, it's absolutely worth it since our build is all about constant crits, meaning this will be triggering all the time. We use Frost Wall as our triggered spell, which creates a wall that we instantly break, causing massive explosions. To make this even better, we add Icicle, which reduces the wall's life, ensuring it shatters immediately. Fortress helps by generating more walls, increasing the chain reaction, while Spell Cascade spreads the explosion effect, making sure everything in a huge area gets wiped out. Finally, Impetus boosts cast on critical efficiency by 40% more energy, making the explosion loop even faster. The result? You hold down Tempest Flurry, land a crit, trigger Frost Wall, instantly destroy it, and cause screen-wide explosions that obliterate everything. Now, let's talk about Tempest Bell, which is mainly used against high-health bosses or if you're playing a cheaper version of the build and need extra damage. This skill adds massive burst damage by summoning a deadly shockwave around the boss. We support it with Overabundance, which lets us summon one extra bell, doubling the damage. Then, Close Combat increases damage to nearby enemies, while Concentrated Effect gives 40% more area damage to make sure the boss takes the full impact. Leverage boosts critical strike chance, ensuring this skill always lands with high damage, and finally, Rising Tempest scales elemental damage per active element, making this skill hit even harder. Against bosses, all you need to do is drop 2 Tempest spells and their health bar will disappear in seconds. Lastly, we have Herald of Ash, which is only needed for the budget version of the build. This skill provides extra explosions when we overkill an enemy, making it perfect for clearing large packs and adding free extra damage. The reason Herald of Ash works so well here is because it also triggers when we overkill our own Frost Wall, so it works against bosses as well, meaning we keep summoning walls, overkilling them, and causing even more explosions. If you're using cheaper gear, this skill is essential to maintain high damage output, making sure you still deal great damage even without the best items. And we support it with Fire Mastery for more damage, Magnified Effect for extra area damage, and finally, if you still have Spirit, put Precision to post all our skill DPS. How this build works for mobs and bosses. This build is incredibly simple to play. You just hold down Tempest Flurry, which moves you, attacks enemies, and triggers all the explosions automatically. The moment you reach a pack of mobs, your huge area of effect will melt them instantly before you even get close. Since our crit chance is insanely high, this will automatically trigger Cast on Critical, summoning Frost Walls that get destroyed immediately, causing massive explosions that chain across the screen. If you're using Herald of Ash, this will trigger even more explosions, making sure nothing survives after the first hit. Against bosses, you don't need to change anything. The same setup works perfectly. The only thing you need to do is drop 2 Tempest Bells for extra damage, and that's it. The fight is over. Congratulations, you've just deleted another boss with minimal effort. Now that we've covered the skills, let's move on to the passive tree and gear setup. Let's start with the Ascendancy points, as they play a crucial role in this build. Since our main focus is stacking attributes, the best option here is Gemmling. But guess what? I also tested this build with Deadeye, and it worked perfectly well thanks to the Tailwind buffs. However, Gemmling remains the best fit because it naturally supports attribute bonuses, making our build even stronger. For the Ascendancy choices, we start with Enhanced Effectiveness, which doubles the bonuses from our attributes, making every stat we stack even more powerful. Then we go for Advanced Thaumaturgy, which reduces mana costs, so we never run into mana problems and can fully focus on stacking attributes in our gear and passives instead. And that's it for the Ascendancy points. Simple, but incredibly effective. Now, before we move on to the passive tree, if you're enjoying this video and found it helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps me keep creating more content like this. Now, let's jump into the passive tree and how to optimize this build even further. Before diving into the passive tree, I want to mention that I've created a full path of building and Maxroll planner for this build. You can find the links in the description to easily check where to allocate your points. However, I will also go through important replacements for expensive jewels, so you can still make this build work on any budget. Now, let's go through the passive tree together. Our main goal here is simple. Stack attributes to scale our damage and defenses. Maximize critical hit chance and damage with attack speed. Grab extra sockets to boost damage and energy shield even further. The first priority is heading downward to the star cluster and picking up Polymathy, which scales all attributes by 10%, and Jack of all trades, which gives 2% more damage per 5 points of our lowest attribute. This is why we want to keep our attributes as balanced as possible to fully maximize the bonus from this node. On the way, we grab 2 sockets, allowing us to fit attribute scaling jewels that further enhance our damage and survivability. Next, we move toward critical strike bonuses, picking up Tainted Strike, which massively boosts our crit rate, ensuring that cast on critical triggers constantly. From there, we grab Falcon Dive, which scales attack speed with accuracy, making it a perfect fit since accuracy naturally scales with dexterity. To further optimize our crit damage, we move into the heart-stopping, struck-through, and heartbreaking clusters, giving us consistent crits with massive damage output. Since this build is dexterity-heavy, we also take Falcon Technique, which automatically increases our attack speed as dexterity increases, making it one of the strongest passives for this build. On the way, we pick up Enhanced Reflexes, granting 8% dexterity scaling. From here, we move into Martial Artistry, which increases accuracy, crit damage, and dexterity. Then into True Strike and the Jugular, both of which scale our crit damage even further. Now, we aim to activate Spaghettification, which provide a huge attribute boost. Even though this node reduces chaos resistance, it's still worth taking. Later in the jewel setup, I'll show multiple ways to activate it efficiently. To finalize the passive tree, we take Deep Trace, which grants more attributes, reduces mana cost, and increases attack speed. Then, we grab Ingenuity for extra intelligence scaling, and finally, Patient Barrier, which significantly boosts energy shield, making this build incredibly tanky while maintaining high DPS. At level 92, this passive tree is fully optimized for damage and survivability, but if you level up further, you have 2 main options. You can prioritize more sockets to fit jewels that increase both damage and energy shield. Or, if you want an extra defensive layer, you can grab Mental Perseverance, which gives you extra defensive layer and make hits go through mana before health, giving you even more sustain. However, with huge energy shield and health pools, capped resistances, and natural sustain from the build, I personally didn't find the need for it. And that's the full breakdown of the passive tree. Now, let's move on to the jewel setup and see how we can push this build to its absolute maximum potential. Firstly, we're going with Against the Darkness, which provides increased dexterity and intelligence. We'll place it near True Strike, allowing us to benefit from True Strike for the Jugular, Deep Trace, and Spaghettification, which help maximize our attribute scaling and push our overall build potential even further. Now let's talk about how to activate Spaghettification, which is now a powerful passive that boosts attributes significantly. There are a few ways to do this depending on your budget and available jewels. The first way is by using a Megalomaniac Diamond, which is a great option since it can roll spaghettification along with another strong passive that complements our build. If you find one that synergizes well, this is the good, efficient way. The second way is using a From Nothing Diamond with passives around Resonance, which allows us to take spaghettification while also saving 2 passive points. This makes it an excellent choice if you want a more efficient pathing in the skill tree without wasting unnecessary passives. But if you can't afford any of these options yet, that's completely fine. Just skip it for now and keep progressing. The build is already strong enough on its own, and you can always upgrade later when you have more resources. Next, if you have the currency, the best jewel in the build is the Adorned Diamond, which is an extremely powerful option that provides huge scaling to all the other jewels we will be using. However, this jewel can be quite expensive, and if it's out of your budget, you can always use rare jewels as an alternative. Now, either you are going with Magic Corrupted or rare jewels. Those are the attributes to look for. The most important stats to look for are increased maximum energy shield, critical hit chance, critical damage bonus, and could be lightning or cold damage. These modifiers will give the build a huge boost in both offense and defense. We're also going to cap our resistances using jewels. The trick here is to find jewels that are enchanted with the missing resistances you need. While these aren't always cheap, you can add them one by one over time until you eventually max out all resistances. With the additional boost from the Adorned Diamond, reaching full resistance cap will be much easier. But if you can't afford everything right away, don't worry, just use rare jewels with the right mods until you can upgrade later. With the passive tree and jewels fully optimized, we now have the foundation set for the build. The last piece of the puzzle is gearing. So let's go through what items you need to maximize both your survivability and damage output. Now let's break down the gearing for this build, starting with the most essential piece, our weapon. Since we are an attribute stacking build, we are using Pillar of the Caged God, a quarterstaff that scales insanely well with all attributes. This weapon is what makes the build shine, as the more attributes we stack, the more our damage skyrockets. For the sockets, we are focusing on attack speed to maximize our Tempest Flurry uptime and damage, and if you have a solid enough budget, try to get another one with socketed gems that penetrate elemental resistances. This will absolutely melt bosses in seconds. Next, for the helmet, we are using Atziri's Disdain, which plays a huge role in generating a massive energy shield beside good amount of rarity. This helmet converts 30% of maximum life into energy shield, and since we already have a solid health pool thanks to our strength scaling, this gives us a base energy shield value that gets multiplied even more through our jewel setup. As you can see, this setup pushes our energy shield beyond 6,000, making it extremely tanky. We'll socket this helmet with elemental resistances to further ensure we stay capped. For the armor, we're going with Morior Invictus, an incredibly strong chest piece that grants elemental resistances and a massive attribute boost, allowing us to scale our core stats even higher. This armor is a key piece of the build, as it allows us to fully maximize our attribute bonuses while also keeping resistances in check. If you have the budget, aim for 5 sockets, but if you're just starting, a 4-socket version is still more than enough to carry you through the content. Moving on to the gloves, we are using Hands of Wisdom and Action, which directly convert our intelligence and dexterity into lightning damage and attack speed. This is another key piece of the build as it allows us to push our damage even further while maintaining high attack speed. To further enhance our rings, we are also using a utility belt, which dramatically amplifies the stats provided by our rings, making them much stronger. Now, for the boots, we have 2 different options, depending on your personal preference. Some people love Trampletoe, as it allows you to obliterate bosses in seconds. However, some players feel like this item is buggy, or might get nerfed in future patches. If you are comfortable with it, go ahead and use it. It provides a serious boost in boss fights. Maybe even saving it for T4 bosses only, since it can be a bit too explosive for mapping. I mean, if your PC starts screaming, you know why. But if you prefer a more stable approach, you can simply use any high-energy shield boots with missing resistances. Since movement speed is completely irrelevant in this build, because we move with Tempest Flurry, you can grab a much cheaper pair of boots with high-energy shield, resistances, and ideally some chaos resistance. I will also showcase Tier 4 boss fight without Trampletoe to make sure the builds still work without it. For rings, our priority is attribute stacking, as this is the core mechanic behind our scaling. Beyond that, look for additional life. Mana, add lightning damage, or cold damage to attack. All of these will help fine-tune the build for better performance. But the biggest game changer here is our amulet. If you're rich enough, you'll want to go for Ascendancy, as this massively boosts all attributes, effectively doubling our damage output. However, if you can't afford it yet, don't worry, the build is still incredibly strong without it. Instead, find a rare amulet with high attributes, some spirit, and either life, energy shield, or mana, whatever extra stats you can find. And if you're running the cheaper amulet, activate Herald of Ash to trigger even more explosions, making up for some of the lost power. And here, we will allocate pure power, which scale lightning damage crazy with our intelligence. Finally, our mana sustain is already stable, but since we don't have much natural regeneration, it's highly recommended to use the Melting Maelstrom Ultimate Mana Flask to ensure you can sustain Tempest Flurry over long fights. And the last piece of the puzzle is a charm that grants freeze immunity, as this prevents us from getting locked in place during crucial fights. And that's it for the gear setup. This build is fully optimized for both insane damage and high survivability, making it a super strong, effortless way to clear maps and take down even the hardest bosses. And now, let's put this build to the test under different conditions to give you a clear idea of its performance. First, I'll start with the fully optimized setup. Ascendancy, Trampletoe, and everything in place. As you can see, the boss didn't even get a second to react. The build completely melts through high-tier enemies effortlessly. Now, let's test it without Trampletoe. Here, you'll notice that our resistances remain rock solid, and while we lose a bit of extra burst damage, the build still performs insanely well, even against tougher bosses. Finally, let's see how the build performs without Ascendancy, using just a rare amulet with attributes and energy shield. The results? Still very strong. The build remains incredibly effective, proving that even without the most expensive gear, you can dominate high-tier content. Now that you've seen the build in every stage, you have a clear idea of how it performs with different setups. And now, before we wrap things up, let's take a quick final look at the build's overall stats. Damage output. Completely melts bosses in seconds. Defenses. Huge energy shield. High health. Capped resistances, which make this build very tanky. Scaling potential. The build works on any budget, with easy upgrades as you progress. Ease of play. Just hold the button and watch everything disappear. With all that said, this is one of the most fun, powerful, and effective builds I played in Path of Exile 2. And that's a wrap! Whether you go all in with Ascendancy and Trampletoe, or run a budget setup, this build melts everything. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like, leave a comment, and let me know if you're trying this out. And don't forget to subscribe for more insane builds and Path of Exile 2 content. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.